Okay, look, I know that the words development and deployment look very similar. They sound kind of similar, but they're not the same thing. And it's important that we keep the distinction between them very clear as we move forward. So, you might be used to situations with legacy stuff where you're using something called an update set, and that update set might get used for both managing the development process and then the subsequent deployment of whatever it is you just did. Well, what we're going to see in this scoped application development process is that update sets tend to kind of fall into the background, and many people prefer to connect to a source control repository, or a Git, that's Git, Git solution, for managing the development process. And then we've got this nice thing called the application repository that we can use for deploying our application. In other words, moving updates to our application, moving new versions of our application from one instance to another, say promoting it from the dev instance to a test instance to production, that kind of thing. Now, I don't want to do a big long lecture on update sets here, but if you haven't used update sets before, you can kind of think of them like, and I'm really going to date myself here, a cassette tape. You know, maybe in 1989, you were sitting by your cassette player, dialed to your local FM radio station because you heard that the hot new Duran Duran song was going to debut, and you wanted to make sure that you recorded it, because this is how self-respecting lovers of music stole music back in the day. And there was a bit of an art to this, wasn't there? Making sure that we only start recording just in time, but not too late, and making sure that we stop recording to the cassette once the song is over, because nobody cares what the DJ is saying, nobody wants the commercials. Well, I think update sets are kind of similar, because you have to tell ServiceNow that you want it to start remembering what you're doing and when to stop it as well. And then, once you mark that update set as complete, you can move it to other instances in your stack, or you can even export the update set as an XML file and move it to instances outside your stack of instances. And so this is still the way to go for customizing baseline applications. But if you have any experience doing this, you know that there's some process involved. And especially if you got multiple developers working on stuff, and you got to come up with some sort of game plan here for what's going to get captured to which update set and who's in charge of it, and whether we're going to merge these update sets or put them into a parent-child hierarchy and manage them. And then you might even deal with things like moving the update sets in a linear fashion from instance to instance and then cloning backwards. And okay, yeah, that's fine. But you know what else? You know what else you can do is this. You can work with something called the application repository. And the application repository is just a bit of server space. And just like your instances are linked together with the app creator company code property that I mentioned briefly back on the scope namespace slide, so too is your application repository. Only instances with that same property, with that same app creator company code, can access the applications that have been published to the repository and then install those applications. Moreover, they can then roll back, update, or even do a wholesale uninstall of those applications. And you don't have to go through the same rigmarole that you do with update sets. So diagrammatically, it might look something like this. So your scoped applications get installed into different instances in your stack, in much the same way that you might just install an application on your mobile device. You open up the correct application to find your other applications, and you tap something, and then boom, it downloads and installs. That's the same experience that this is meant to give you. So again, this is not really meant for managing things like individual code commits or different branches or versions of your application or code documentation. That's all typically done with source control repositories. At this point now, we're talking about deployment, deploying our application and versions thereof using the application repository. But there is one little hiccup with this, and that is you can't really deploy your application to a local file. So what if you made this real cool thing in your personal developer instance and you wanted to share it with other people in the ServiceNow community? Well, the application repository won't help you there. And you might be thinking, well, dude, if I wasn't running an update set, how am I going to export it? Well, fear not. I'll show you how this works. But basically, anything you make that's not just a dumb old transient data record, but anything you make that's part of the structure, scaffolding, and behavior of your application automatically gets recorded to a table called the application files table. In this case, that's roughly analogous to what you might know as the customer updates table in the little related list at the bottom of each update set that you look at. And ServiceNow can take all those records from the application files table, in other words, everything that's been recorded as part of your application, and it can easily bundle them up into an update set, and then you can export as an XML file. We're going to do that at the end of class, so you still get the best of all possible worlds. Earlier on in class, I mentioned we are going to be working on an application together, and I will introduce this application to you in a little while. Our application is a sample application that is meant to help manage some loaner equipment stuff. And you may have heard tell of this application over the years. You may even talk about this application one day over a nice peanut butter and jelly sandwich in the local canteen and hear that it's showing its age. Well, I'm here to tell you that one of the things we love about this application in this class is that it's a nice way to learn about the different tools in your toolkit. Or if you prefer, to learn about the different gears and cogs that allow us to cobble together some machinery. This machinery we might call an application. So you can see some of the expected behaviors of this application along its critical path if you read the bullet points. And you know how I feel about reading bullet points out loud. I'm not going to do it. Just no. But I will demonstrate this to you briefly. And you'll depart from this class with, I hope, your mind kind of alight with all these nice ideas of how you can meet the requirements set forth in your next application, because you know some of the different approaches and techniques that are available, be they older ones or newer ones. ServiceNow does not have like a proprietary app development process that you have to go learn and that you can get little initials that you put after your LinkedIn. No, there's none of that. You develop how you want. And I know that this slide looks awfully linear, but this does lend itself perfectly well to a nice, successively approximating, iterative development process where we start with kind of a cube of clay, and like a good sculptor, we start to shave away until the ideal art form that was contained therein has been revealed. In the next module, we're going to talk just a little bit about analysis and design, and then from there on out, you can think of the rest of the class as kind of a successive process of developing and deploying. And towards the very end of this class, we'll briefly look at some testing options. If it were up to me, I'd say that testing would be a part of every little sprint, but I'll save my speech about that for another time. So, in short, you do you. Whatever development practices work for you and your team and your organization, great, perfect, fantastic. And don't get the impression that things have to be strictly linear or have to be really anything. So what do you need to know in order to do this? What skills do you need? The first thing I would say is, ideally, a good solid understanding of the platform and its data model, and a lot of the concepts that you might learn in ServiceNow Administration Fundamentals, and maybe ServiceNow Administration Advanced. And then if you look on the right side of the slide, I love a little bit of controversy. And I want to give you my honest, unfiltered opinion about this. I don't speak for ServiceNow. I speak as your humble facilitator and what I really think when I make this statement. And that is, even just achieving a mild amount of literacy in ServiceNow's dialect of JavaScript is a fantastic idea. Maybe you hear all the buzz about no-code development and how we can, in ServiceNow, quite equitably bust out these rad applications that don't need a whole lot of script or code to them, if any. And you know, that is true. And I think that's wonderfully in line with what I understand Fred Luddy's original vision for the platform to be, right? This idea that automating a process ought to be accessible to everyone. But you know, as someone who grew up in a family of software developers, I violently resisted the idea of doing that for a living. Here I am at a software company, but I am not and have never been a dyed-in-the-wool, full-time software developer. And yet, every time I learn a little bit more of ServiceNow's dialect of JavaScript, I know that I've now powered up a bit. I've got new skills that I can bust out. Because if you think of your solution as a nice bit of masonry, right? You've got these stones that you need to cobble together. Well, you're going to be kind of plugging in the gaps between the stones as you place them upon one another, as you're building your levee or whatever it might be. And I really do think that it's a grasp of ServiceNow's dialect of JavaScript that lets you patch in those holes. It's kind of the mortar that holds the rocks together. And instead of being limited to what's possible with strictly configuration and no-code development, you more and more become a toolsmith. You start to create the exciting custom components that the rest of your team can leverage. And so there's no need to be a code ninja. Just shooting for a beginner-mediate level of competence is a wonderful endeavor to have, and it doesn't need to be intimidating. All that to say, when we move beyond no-code development, yes, ServiceNow's custom classes and functions that are built into its odd dialect of JavaScript get new love with every release, and it's not going anywhere. And for those of you taking this class because you really want to snag that nice certified application developer certification, and you want to stick those 3 letters after your name on LinkedIn, well, if you've not taken the scripting course, you better go take scripting in ServiceNow Fundamentals, because that entire class is considered fair game for the exam at the time of this recording. Now, as of the Utah release, and of course, therefore, so too in Vancouver, privately scoped applications that you create start with ECMAScript 2021 being the default JavaScript mode. And this is, frankly, relatively new to ServiceNow. We were hanging out in ECMAScript 5 land for a long time, and that meant things like the let keyword and the const keyword and other nifty tricks, I think like arrow functions and things like that, were utterly alien to ServiceNow. But now, such is not the case. And if you dig into the documentation, I'll tell you, when it comes to client-side stuff, even some newer script standards than that are supported. I'm really looking forward to seeing what this means for us. I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of code libraries we decide to bring into ServiceNow now that we can run on this kind of up-to-date compatibility. But I will point out that by and large, if you're a linguist and you take a look at ServiceNow's dialect of JavaScript, you might label it, and I'm using air quotes here, as a conservative dialect. That's not a political statement. That means that it conserves features of an older version of the language. And that's kind of true. Looking at a lot of the underlying JavaScript in ServiceNow tends to look like we're reading a novel that had maybe been written in the first few years of the 20th century, to compare that to modern English. Completely intelligible, but showing its age. That has recently changed. Right now we can be straight bussin', no cap, dropping that slang like the kids do. I don't know, we get the up-to-date JavaScript. But if you need to turn back that compatibility, you certainly can. And there's more information on that in your book. So there's lots of resources out there. I'm not planning to walk you through all of these, my friends. You probably know about the ServiceNow community. You know that if you Google something about ServiceNow, one of your top results is probably going to be coming from community.servicenow.com. If you don't know about the community, I'll be a little blasé in describing it to you thusly. It is a gamified message board with all the pros, cons, and trappings that you could imagine from that. People out there on the community rely heavily on their community reputation to get work. And sometimes, if you ask a question in the community, it's kind of like throwing a pork chop into like a pond full of piranhas. I mean, they're more than happy to answer your question. The good news is that you get lots of support. But there's also developer.servicenow.com. And of course, there's Now Learning, which I suspect if you're listening to this, you're familiar with. And of course, there's the product documentation, which has recently been revamped at the time of this recording at docs.servicenow.com. And then there's, of course, the ServiceNow store. I've alluded to this before, and this is where you can go out and get lots of neat new stuff. And with that, I'd like you to consider some of the things we've discussed. I hope that you feel comfortable with some of these basic concepts, and that I've got you excited about moving forward. In the next module, we're going to look at some simple thoughts on design and why that's important. And in Module 3, we'll finally roll up our sleeves and put our hands into the digital dirt and start making something. Keep up the good work.